and welcome to the Disability Education and Society podcast. This is a podcast for collective learning and unlearning in the struggle for intersectional liberation. We focus on educational realms, expanding to other societal areas. We share our stories as academics as well as those of our featured guests, including disability activists involved with multifaceted dimensions of systems equity, self-determination efforts, anti-ableist, and anti-racist liberation. Join us as co-conspirators. Today's episode features Dr. Juuso H. Nieminen. Dr. Nieminen is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong and a Banting Fellow at Ontario Tech University in Canada. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Eastern Finland and an honorary fellow at the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University in Australia. Dr. Nieminen's research concerns educational assessment from social, cultural, and political points of view. He is particularly interested in the student perspective in the matters of assessment. Dr. Nieminen has also studied assessment from the viewpoints of inclusion, equity, and diversity.
So, Yuso, we're going to begin the conversation by having you share a personal story that's related to disability. I think that would be a good beginning to our conversation today.
Yeah, I actually have a story from this morning. So earlier today, I was giving a workshop for another university in Hong Kong. And this university, or this teaching and learning unit of this university, approached me that they would be interested in developing their inclusive assessment practices. And I was not just personally flattered, but also quite interested. There is a university in Hong Kong interested in these issues, because you can't really say that disability rights would be the priority number one in this city. Anyway, I gave this workshop and it was absolutely wonderful. And participants were really engaging, and I rarely get that kind of a warm and just welcoming atmosphere in these situations. Often when you train teachers about inclusive assessment, the atmosphere tends to be a bit tense. But anyway, the story is that after this talk, one of the participants contacted me, and this participant happened to be a staff member who had also been a student at this university, and they shared that they had never before thought about the fact that something might be wrong about assessment design, that assessment itself might need to somehow change or be more inclusive or more accessible. But for their whole life, they had thought that it's their fault and they are the one who needs to be fighting for accommodations, but assessment in itself can never change. And that was a good reminder for me, who've been working with these topics for quite some time, that in fact, that is quite often the prevalent idea that we have in practice, that assessment just is, it remains as is, and then we add layers on top of it. And this rather emotional context that I got, it really made me remind her about the power of assessment that we have for disabled folks out there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so, as I understand, this was a conversation you had with this university and was among, like you mentioned, staff and faculty member there. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and that was something that you mentioned when the staff members came up to you and had this conversation about assessment. Oh, that's very fascinating. Thank you for sharing that story.
Really interesting. I'm getting an image in my mind that's not in the script at all, but I think it's a good segue into the next set of questions that I want to ask you, and I'm thinking of something religious in the sense that there is a story in the Bible that the Jewish and Christian folks have in common as their scriptural source. It's the story of the golden calf. Apparently, people got very impatient. They were waiting for Moses to come down with the tables of the law, and he would delay too much. And people would say to the person in charge, in the absence of Moses, it was Aaron, to build a golden calf for them to worship instead of God. So sometimes I feel that we get into this idolatry of it's almost like we're having an idolatrous relationship with assessment. And this is not something I'm making up. Saint-Simon, a sociologist in the 19th century, said that science, in this case math or assessment, would become the new religion once we did away with the irrational modes of religion. So it was going to become a rationalistic, scientific religion, and the new priests, he said, would be scientists, assessment experts, researchers, that sort of thing. And I mean, to me, it all just talks about new spheres of power, that sometimes we are trying to transgress the old system and we want to create something new. In the process, we are just installing a new priesthood, a new system of power that controls everything. Do you want to react to that? Because I know you have a lot of interesting experiences with power, and your own research has dealt with a lot of these discursive constructions, and how assessment becomes its own golden calf, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. I really like this idea of thinking about assessment from a religious perspective. It makes me think about the concept of holy or sacred, and how there might be once in a while some elements about assessment, particularly in mathematics, that are sacred in a sense that they should not be touched upon, they should not be discussed, or we having a conversation about whether something sacred or holy needs to be replaced or changed in a way. That's a very bold move. You don't just start these conversations just like that. Hey, by the way, and I think that lens to assessment might reveal something about it. And there's a lot about that I can understand. When I was working in school before I started my academic career, I was trained as a math teacher. There was a big part of me that was not interested in assessment at all, because of course we know how mathematics needs to be assessed. We know how it works. We have exams, and that's it. And this is really the attitude that I've faced, the ways in which we assess mathematics. It's something just solid and untouchable, and in a way apolitical, and just so rational that we can't actually even start a conversation about it. So I really like this replacement or tension or intertwinement between something religious and something rational. And I wonder how much these ideas intertwine in our current art discourses about assessment. It makes me, you mentioned sociologist whose name I didn't know. Let me name drop another one. Makes me think about Patricia Proudfoot, a sociologist of educational assessment, who was I think in the late 80s or early 90s talking about modernist discourse, by which she referred to how classroom assessment, so assessment that is conducted by teachers, how that assessment is doing its best to have a kind of a rationalist vocabulary and rationalist practices that would somehow imitate scientific measurements, and how that modernist discourse It's kind of upholding a certain understanding of assessment as something untouchable, because when we understand it to be objective and an act of measurement, what is there to discuss about? That's true and sacred in a way.
Hmm.
This is my
And it's interesting because it's also a recognition that teachers don't have power, and so for them to really become powerful, they have to get a new kind of dressing, and they get dressed as scientists by becoming assessment experts and using the right language, uh, the proper pronouncements, almost like going through the rituals of becoming assessment experts without being truly scientists or truly researchers. Or that's sort of an interesting recognition, right? You're almost bowing to assessment because you know that as a teacher you really don't have power, and the real power resides there with the scientific assessment language and that sort of thing. Don't you think?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I would say that in my current context of Hong Kong, that's very much the case. The educational system really relies on testing, and teachers, whatever they do in their classrooms, has to be somehow related to the testing mechanisms. This is the very traditional washback effect, or backwash effect, with both terms I used weirdly, of high-stakes testing on classroom assessment practice. But then when I think about Finland, where I'm from, by the way. So in Finland, teachers in comprehensive education and in higher education, they have all the power and all the autonomy they could ever have. So in Finland, comprehensive education doesn't have national testing at all. Teachers have all the autonomy to do whatever they want to do in assessment. Same in higher education. In mathematics, there's no standardization of assessment. Every teacher can do exactly what they want to. If you as an individual teacher want to change how you assess, you can do that tomorrow, and no one's going to force you to do anything. And even then, we know that in Finland, both in schools and in universities or in higher education institutions, mathematics is assessed through exams, and that's it. And I did my PhD in this idea of trying to change assessment in the university context, and I was studying the power relations attached or within, and it was interesting. I'm not blaming the teachers here, but there seemed to be something much greater than the teachers, because even though they had this autonomy, when we changed assessment in one single mathematics course in the context of Finland, where grades have absolutely no value, it really doesn't matter if you get the highest score or the lowest score. Really, the employers are not going to care about that. The university doesn't care about that. So it's a really low stakes assessment culture. We changed assessment in one single course in this context, and even that was considered to be something extremely radical by other teachers, by students, by other faculty members. And I know that some of them are still talking about this assessment experiment that we did in this one course. There's a part of me that thinks, who cares? It was just one course. Whatever we did doesn't really influence anyone's lives too much. But we were poking that sacred thing.
So they have autonomy, but at the same time, they're worshiping assessment. I mean, in their own sense of autonomy, they're still attaching too much value to assessment. That's sort of the situation there.
Yeah, or just certain types of assessment. I mean, we're talking about examinations here.
Right, examinations. The traditional types. Paulo, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I found it very fascinating when you started comparing the Hong Kong context to the Finland context, and then Alexis and I are here in the United States context, and how different those three are. And what I hear you saying, there's still like an underlying kind of a very strong force of assessment that's, even though in the Finland context, as we here in the United States, for a long time, people were revering the Finland education system, as you mentioned, teacher autonomy, teacher professionalism that is kind of very different than even the U.S., where assessments are a big constraint. So I was really interested to when you talked about like when you did this one assessment change in a very what was different about that assessment? I mean, because it sounds like it caused quite a bit of stir in that Finnish context, and so just I wanted you to share a little bit more about what you did in that assessment that had this kind of reaction in this Finnish context.
Yeah. So what we did was a kind of an early example of uncrating, which is the cool new term that Americans particularly like to use, or North Americans at the moment, which basically means trying to get rid of grades, which might be a bit tricky in context where you absolutely do need to provide grades for your students. So what we did was we knew that we had a large student body of undergraduate mathematics students in this context of large courses. So we, in this one course that I was studying, we had around 400 students, so a big course. And we knew that this student body is extremely interested in grades, even though, again, they do not really matter that much in higher education, but it's in Finland. And we wanted to somehow shake up this idea that the students would be studying for their exams and studying for their grades, which at the time we thought was something very important. And we simply, basically, we asked the students to decide their own grades after this course. Of course, this was a bit more complex than that. We didn't simply just do that. We trained them to self-assess their own mathematical abilities. We provided them a lot of feedback. We asked them to engage with that feedback. We provided them also a lot of feedback on their self-assessments. And in this way, try to support their autonomy as learners. And the results were in many ways of measurements, both statistical and qualitative, wonderful. Many of the students, they really realized that now when they had to really be in control of their own grading system, they at the same time they realized how ridiculous the actual system is. So nowadays when I think back about what we did, we were always ridiculing grading and grades in a way, and trying to make students understand that this doesn't actually matter that much. But even though it quite literally does not matter, if any student in that one single course would have gotten, using the global scale, if failed grade or A plus, really wouldn't have mattered anyway. So even in that context, that was considered to be something very, very radical.
Right, but I think some students were still kind of longing for the old grading system. Did you experience some of that?
Absolutely, yes. And what we found was that some students had this almost like an extreme form of lacking agency. Some students reported that they were not able to study. They were not able to take that control, if you will, of their own learning process. And interestingly, even though, as I mentioned, the course had hundreds of participants and only one teacher, of course, a lot of student assistants, student tutors, many other staff members, but still only one lead teacher. Some students even reported that they have, like, how could they know their own mathematical abilities, even with a lot of materials, rubrics, support, feedback? It is the teacher who knows my real abilities. And we thought, well, that's quite literally untrue, because there are hundreds of students and the teacher doesn't know anything about any individual student. So yeah, very, very interesting. You could really see how whatever we did was not only about this one course. It was about using one specific example in one specific time to reveal something about a much wider culture of mathematics education.
This is irreverent, but it's probably in the coffee I drink this morning. It feels like we're many students in this lack of agency. They are grade junkies. That they really need. If you take off the the drug of grading, they feel that something big is missing and they go crazy, right? You have this dependence that really creates a culture of lack of agency, um, very much. We talk about critical thinking and all these different things at the higher education level, but grading creates the dependency that prevents that autonomous development from occurring. Don't you think?
I'm trying to be a bit careful here. I by that I mean I don't want to blame someone or something if it's not completely necessary. I think students are grade junkies and teachers as well, because grades they're the currency of education. They're the money that we use, and they actually have real value in many contexts. My example previously came from Finnish higher education, where the grades do not actually matter. That's a bit of an outlier globally. For example, here in Hong Kong, the grades they absolutely do matter, and yes, your employer is definitely interested in your GPA, grade point average. And in that sense, to me, what you said is almost close to saying that someone is a money junkie. Like, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't like to have a bit more money? Because with money, you can get to many different places on this planet. And it's the same with grades. They have some very real, concrete power that's not abstract, but really takes you to places. So, of course, we are grade junkies. But I'm not sure if that's because of the grades. The grades are just numbers. They don't have a lot of agency.
I love the fact you use currency, because it makes me think of I'm originally from Venezuela, and Venezuela has been going a currency crisis that's very weird, and I think it's deliberately provoked by the government. They have a legal currency called the bolivar, which has been there forever, but if you pay people with bolivars, they don't want that money. They basically throw that currency away. They want dollars, and so even if you go to buy a hot dog in the street, you have to pay that with dollars. The vendors in the market, everybody wants dollars, and they only use dollars, even though the legal currency is the bolivar, which speaks of issues of empire and power. I mean, going back to having currencies and currencies. You see what I mean? You have currencies that, by their very nature, become the only one that really controls monetary value, and instead of saying, well, this is still money, and you can translate it into so many bolivars to get a dollar. People just do away with their the real currency, the one that's supposed to be legally binding in that country, and they would prefer to go with a dollar because it allows them to have a more global sense of currency, and getting them connected with the empire, with the real relations of power, right?
Yeah, and of course the difference with grades is that they're not really very objective from a measurement point of view. I mean, no matter how objective you are as a teacher, how fair you are as a teacher, grading is still it's always a piece of crafting. It's never really compared. It's never really comparable with those actual systems of measurement that we have, like standardized testing. It's grading is very rarely based on actual psychometric premises, for example. So in a way, we have teachers who are not psychometricians, or they that would be a bit of an outlier case, that somehow control and have power over this currency. So it's certainly an interesting situation from the viewpoint of power.
Right, and that's essentially where I wanted to go when we started this portion of the conversation, is the issue of power, because a lot of the discussion in trying to deal with assessment issues, it surrounds the notion of power. And so I was wondering if there is a way to bring the conversation into a different approach, or at least to rethink the idea of power. And I thought of Stephen Luke's definition of power. He's a political scientist, a political philosopher. I like the second edition, which came out in 2004, because it has some other new essays. The book is called Power, A Radical View. And he has a definition of power that is, to me, very interesting, because he defines power in terms of the ability to keep things, certain things, out of the agenda, so that they don't really become visible or end up being discussed by anybody. Do you think that there are some things in the world of assessment that are kept out of the agenda, even though they may be relevant for the sake of assessment purpose? Because you mentioned a while ago, when I said assessment, you said, well, we're really talking about examinations, which is only one kind of assessment. And we tend to be narrow-minded when it comes to thinking of assessment. So part of the issue is that there are some things that appear to be swept away from the agenda, from the discussion of things that could be part of assessment, but they are not high in the agenda. What's your reaction to that idea?
My reaction is that, as I noted briefly earlier, we really conceptualize assessment both at the classroom level, but also in its high stakes forms, as a practice of measurement. That's really the global trend that is not a very new trend. This idea of measurement is really the backbone of how we talk and think about assessment. And that means that certain ideas that do not meet this psychometric understanding of what assessment is and why assessment is conducted, they might be left in the margins. I have a very good example of coming from Finland again. We are currently undergoing an assessment reform in Finland in comprehensive education, so in primary and lower secondary education. So far, as I mentioned earlier, we have never had national tests. Oh, sorry, we don't have national tests in Finland. We do not have standardized tests in a similar way as countries around the world do. At the moment, teachers provide students with the final grades when they leave lower secondary education and when they apply for high schools or vocational education. So teachers have a lot of power there. And it's been a rather long ongoing political discussion about whether that's right or wrong, whether those grades are comparable when they're just provided by teachers. Now, of course, all of this happens in a context where schools are very equal. That doesn't have a kind of a top school system. This kind of a system is definitely not working in Hong Kong. So we're currently undergoing a reform where teachers are provided with rubrics that they are supposed to use when they provide those final grades. And the purpose of this reform is to make the final grades after lower secondary education more comparable, so that they would have better psychometric values, so to say, when students apply for further education. And this is a very good example of how political conversation from all spectrums of politics, from the left up to the right, everyone's only talking about assessment as a process of measurement. Fairness of assessment is only understood as a matter of measurement, and whether this measurement process is valid, reliable, comparable. And this is only one way of talking about assessment, but that is very much the dominant one. And any other forms of any other discourses related to assessment, such as what I'm doing in my work related to inclusion, belonging, equity, that doesn't really fit that overall psychometric understanding, or if it is seen to fit this ideal of measurement, it's only seen from that perspective. Very often when I talk about inclusion of disabled people in assessment, people understand that in a way that, oh, you mean the rights of disabled people to participate in objective testing. So it's very hard to widen this discourse.
Hi there. While we intend to make our podcast as accessible as possible, we ask those that have the financial means to support us by subscribing as a patron to our podcast for as little as $5 a month. To subscribe, go to our website, disabilityed.podbean.com. By subscribing as a patron, you will help ensure that we can continue to create and share new episodes while supporting other co-conspirators who face financial and health difficulties. For those with financial difficulties, please connect with us about obtaining a free copy of our books and/or engaging in additional conversations with us. You can also support this show by hitting the follow button. Share this podcast with among your network and leave us a comment and positive rating. Your support means so much.
Yeah, this has been so wonderful. You have touched upon so many important aspects, and just to narrow down to maybe one of the ideas is that going back to what you were saying about the Finnish context, and in higher education, there's like the grading is not even anything that is matters. I think in the U.S., in the context that I am most familiar with, is that I work with elementary teachers for the most part, and so again, they are in the context of higher education, where grade, as we talked about, has currency, and yet in elementary schools here in the U.S., grading is kind of like what you said is in the Finnish context, right? It doesn't matter what grade you get. There's a lot more caring involved in elementary school, sense of belonging, inclusiveness, or at least in most cases, that's the situation. So I'm thinking in the context of a prospective teacher who's in that situation, who's sort of being pulled, I feel like, in many directions. It's like, okay, I'm in higher education, grades really matter, right? I need an A in this class. And here in the US, there's an issue of grade inflation, right? Everybody gets an A, and what does that mean now? So, I mean, so there's a lot of things going on with this group of folks, particular, very, very specific group of folks. And so I'm wondering about that, because I know you also work with prospective teachers there in Hong Kong. Is that right?
I conduct research with prospective teachers, but I'm actually not teaching prospective teachers because they part in the Hong Kong school system. I don't speak the language, I don't understand the culture, so I'm actually keeping myself separate from that system a bit.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, in the context of higher education in Hong Kong, and in your own research and your own background in the Finnish context, like, what are some of the things that you are doing in terms of pushing back against? I know from what I hear, the Hong Kong context is very rigid in that way, right? Like, if you're trying to do anything that pushes back on assessments, and we talked about ungrading as part of the movement that's going around a lot here in the U.S., and I have colleagues and even myself who have kind of gone in that direction. I'm wondering about you, like you as a higher education faculty member who's working in that institution. What are some of the things that you're doing to kind of challenge these assessment systems, even in very rigid places that you're in?
Oh, many things. First of all, I'm always discussing assessment with my students. Always. My students, when they leave my courses, they have had a trillion dialogues about assessment and grades with me. And that's not something that you can often see happening in the context of mathematics, for example. It's more common that assessment criteria are introduced in the first lecture and so forth, but this ongoing dialogue about assessment, I think that already has a lot of power, even if nothing even changes. At least we're talking about it. And I think that already is one way of shedding light on the complexity of these matters. It's very easy to slip into solutionism and find some easy targets. I can see some of it happening now with this ungrading movement. trying to somehow tackle grades, and which sometimes is a movement that I very much support, and sometimes it seems to be a bit simplistic. What exactly are we tackling? It's again, the grades are just numbers. Are you? And if you're saying that you're somehow tackling the system, what exactly do you mean by that? What is this magical system? All right. So dialogue is certainly the first point that comes to mind. Another one is, I'm a bit adventurous with my with my own assessment methods. Before I was teaching in Hong Kong, I was teaching in Finland, and I have to say that the student population that I have in my classroom is so extremely different. Even without using any assessment research specific vocabulary, like just basically my students in Hong Kong, they're very much interested in their grades. They're very what was the term we use? Grade junkies, again, because they need those grades. A situation where a student would learn a lot but get a low grade is really not acceptable, because that influences your future life. If that situation would have happened to me when I was a university student, and when it happened quite a few times, I couldn't care less. I thought, oh, but at least I learned whatever I needed to learn. So quite often I do provide my students some real agency over their assessment. So many times I co-construct the assessment criteria together with my students. That's in fact something that I do in most of my courses. So the students always have a say in the grading criteria, and they always have a say in how that criteria is being put in practice. I also often co-create some of the assessment materials, maybe tests, self-assessment forms, peer assessment tasks. All these things I often discuss together with my students, and I have started to increasingly use this practice of, after training my students on how assessment criteria work, why they are whatever they are, how my course learning outcomes or course assessment criteria, how they relate to program learning outcomes and program criteria, and so forth. When I've trained my students basically on how assessment works, how criteria work, how assessment practices work, I increasingly provide them agency over their grades. For example, now I'm teaching 2 courses where I'm using quite a substantial time to train students on the matters of assessment and grading, and then I simply just let them choose their grades. And these are master students, so they're not very young university students anymore. But this is something that I've started to do. I've noticed that in Hong Kong, the students also, they have a very different kind of a history with assessment. In fact, I had a privilege to teach one course about assessment literacy, teacher assessment literacy, in the previous semester. And I could have all these dialogues with my students, and all of them were Chinese, from mainland China or from Hong Kong. And the stories that the students had about assessment, they were brutal. And often when I talk with teachers about assessment, I ask them to share some of their own assessment memories. When I did that with this group of students, some people were almost crying. Like, it was a very emotional matter. And I remember one of the students used this saying that when they finally graduate from the final piece of education that they ever take part in, they are free from assessment. Finally, they can experience freedom from assessment. And this really, I've been thinking about that ever since. This is the context where I currently work, and that's why I've started to become a bit of an assessment rebel. Luckily, I have the mandate of being an assessment researcher, so if someone comes to complain, I can cite my own work. Sorry, that was long and meandering.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, sorry, Alexis, just to real quick, I just thought that there are some really great ideas about folks who are engaging in the podcast to hear about and to learn about some of the moves that you're making, again, in the context where assessments is seen as something that is very rigid, and I love the ideas of having dialogue with the students about co-constructing, about doing self-assessments, about thinking about more about student agency. Again, as I think about the context of the US, I mean, these are things that I think that certain segments of the faculty here are doing. I don't think it's still the norm by any means, but I feel like that those are some great ideas for people to kind of keep thinking about. Besides what you said, well, it's just ungrading. Well, yeah, it is ungrading, and it's a lot of these other things that go along with that, and that's a very complex process. So, uh, just a quick follow-up question: how do you feel that's? I mean, you kind of shared a little bit about the Hong Kong context. So, how do you feel? You know, the moves that you're making, the shifts, the conversations, all the things you're doing in the courses. How do you feel that's going so far? How would you assess your your situation there?
um, yeah, well, only once I've needed to have a serious conversation about my assessment. My students were apparently having grades that were too good for this course, but and I kind of said, "Do you want to start a fight? Because I can start a fight. I have all the evidence here. I have the university assessment policy. I have this research over here. So, you want to fight?" And I very much want that one. Yeah, but Hong Kong is also an example of a very individualistic context, in a sense that you do have a lot of autonomy as a teacher in higher education, at least. So I'm joking a bit, and also it's not in a way it's not a nefarious context. But it's certainly a context with a lot of stress and anxiety and a lot of tensions, which does make me feel a bit nervous, and it does make me think about the ethics of my own assessment, because whatever I do in my classrooms really influences the students in ways that are that would not be true in, say, Scandinavia. So I'm trying to make sure that whatever I do, I grab a lot of evidence of student learning, and I really make good use of the evidence, and I'm kind of trying to be creative within these contextual and cultural boundaries that I have in the context. So far, so good. And the student feedback has always been very good. I think the students have also really appreciated that they have these almost like counter spaces where they can actually focus on something else than just focusing on the grades. In my courses, I always force my students to take risks, and I force them to fail, and that's something that might not feel very nice at that moment. But when the students realize that actually might not influence their grades because they are supposed to do risks, eventually, at the end of all of my courses, luckily the student feedback has been positive.
I'm thinking of the dichotomy of competition and cooperation. And I don't know enough about either Hong Kong or Finland. So I don't know if, for example, you could say, well, Hong Kong has a much more competitive structure because of the individualistic ethos than the Finland context, which may emphasize more cooperation or not. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but in both instances, it seems that the notion of caring, whether you're caring to make sure that it cultivates more cooperation than competition, or creating a caring culture that tames the competition stuff so that it doesn't become like the Wild West. No rules at all. Let's kill everybody, and I get ahead of everybody through those means. I mean, it sounds to me that the issue of caring is a big issue. And I've been wondering about something you've written recently about the need to do research to find out what different educational actors, students, teachers, schoolmasters, people who are doing educational stuff, that we need to investigate. There are different kinds of caring, including the way they care about assessment and the way they care about mathematics and the way they care about each other in terms of personal relations. Could you explain about a little bit about the significance of that kind of research as you envision that type of examination of people's preferences for caring, even if it's preferences for caring that are recalcitrant, that are, I prefer to have grading as the biggest thing in my life. I prefer to be chained to that because, I'm lost if I don't have the grading processes. Or how do you envision that kind of research um, occurring or taking place in different contexts? And what do you have in mind there?
I think future research could unpack what and who is cared for in assessment in mathematics and beyond, and by whom. I do think there's a lot of potential in unpacking how different educational agents care about assessment, because they care about the society around assessment. Assessment is always a part of the prevailing society. The stakes are higher than, for example, teaching and learning more generally. You can change some parts of your teaching, but if you change something about assessment, you really change something about the whole stakes of education. And in that sense, some of the actions that are the so-called more progressive approaches to assessment, they might overlook the ways of care that are actually present in many assessment practices. For example, we and I definitely sometimes portray testing or these very rigorous psychometric testing systems as something that should be criticized. Even in this chat that we've had, I think I've had the tendency to do that. But in fact, I think those systems can also be seen as a form of care. They are meant to challenge nepotism in our societies, for example. I think about some of the students in my classrooms who might come from working class backgrounds, whose only way of climbing the ladders in this extremely highly competitive society of Hong Kong is to get high grades, only with their abilities, not with the money and networks that these students might lack. So in that sense, sometimes care might take forms that we as researchers do not always think about. For example, simply prepping a student for a test might in fact be a form of care or an act of care. But is it a care towards the assessment system, towards the student, or for the student, or for the society? What are we caring about when we assess? And that to me is a very interesting question, and I can't provide any answers or solutions here. More just open questions. I don't know what you think.
Well, this is very interesting because here in the United States, a lot of the discussion about equity and assessment is linked to the fact that, and probably this goes to Bourdieu's ideas on cultural capital, for example, that the culture of high stakes assessment is a middle class culture for white people and for people who are not foreigners in terms of language differences. So anytime you have somebody who deviates from that norm, working class folks, racialized groups, people of different languages, people with disabilities, the gender non-conforming, etc., those people tend to be the ones left out of the assessment piece. So when you say, and I think you're right, that the intent of those psychometric validity tests and those kinds of things to have objective measurements that you can compare across the globe. The purpose is to eliminate nepotism, to foment, to foster this idea of meritocracy, right? But at the same time, it's at least the way it operates here in the United States, it's marginalizing the same folks who are already marginalized. And maybe it's working better in places like Hong Kong than in some of the global north contexts. And I know you're also starting to do some stuff in Canada. So you may have a picture about what's really going on with those things. How do you see the balancing of those discourses, which seem to be in contradiction to one another in terms of what high text testing is doing in terms of the caring as a purpose, as a kind of embedded ideal, and the actual practice of marginalization, exacerbating things that are already part of the inequities of education.
Oof, some massive themes here. Oh my goodness, where to start from? Well, first of all, I do have to say that Hong Kong has such a massive shadow education system. The billions of dollars families spend for extracurriculum activities here. I think it starts when kids are like 2 years old and they are already advertised to do some kind of consulting services, and it's the ideal of meritocracy and in assessment in Hong Kong is really a bit of a joke from that perspective. But maybe my 2 cents here is that within these tensions, in terms of how and why assessment is conducted, how it is conducted at a more systemic, high-stakes level, and how it is conducted in classrooms, there are so many different discourses, there are so many different forms and ways of caring, and caring about many different things: students, assessments, teachers, parents, to society, that we simply need to have a rather systemic and comprehensive understanding of what goes on. And I would say that this approach necessarily needs to understand the complexity of all of this, rather than try to aim for simplistic solutions or easy targets. But that's, of course, easier to say out loud than to do in practice. We have some work to do over the next couple of decades, I think.
And I feel like the question, yes, is very, very complex indeed. And I think that what you shared earlier about what you do in your class with dialogue, I think is important, right? As part of it is, I feel like, a care that you're having this dialogue. You're not doing something like a quick fix. You're starting this conversation with students who may not be sort of understanding of these systemic forces that exist. And I think when Alexis was sharing the question, I was kind of reminded of Danny Martin's assertion. So Danny Martin is a math educator, big math educator here in the US, who talks about, like, okay, so we do all the care, let's say we do the equity thing in schools, and then students get out of higher education, they get out of high school, and then what? And they step into a society that's inequitable already. And so what does that mean for our role, let's say, as higher education faculty, for our role as K-12 educators in knowing this? So I feel like what you shared about dialogue, as I kind of reflect on our conversation today, really is one of many steps, yes, that we have to have. Like we have to have these really authentic conversations about what is assessment, what's the role of assessments, what does that mean, right, outside of this context? What does it mean? I think you shared the example of how the currency, like if in the ethics, right? If I don't prepare this working class student to pass this exam, then how have I failed the student? Because then they won't have those opportunities as others. So Yeah, I just wanted to kind of reflect some of these ideas that just came to me as you were both sharing.
Yeah, thanks. So just a few quick reflections. First of all, I think quite interestingly, what I can see happening in both Finland and Hong Kong is that talking about assessment in higher education, actually, we sometimes portray the situation exactly as you did, that when students exit education, then they enter a very nefarious world where they need to be aware of bad things. But it might actually be the other way around, because I've seen some in the STEM fields, in particular in medical fields, it might actually be the industry who is not that interested in exam machines and these grade chunkies. These industries might actually be the ones who are trying to start some kind of a change, because they want employees who can actually do the job and who can actually have all these complex skills that people need in our current societies. So it's a weird tension. Sometimes we critical educators talk quite critically about industry in relation to education, but it might actually be the other way around.
That's an interesting point you're making, because we everybody criticizes the corporatization of universities, but in some ways, if they are going to be the employers of these people, especially talking about STEM and health sciences, which are the biggest employers, the ones that pay more money. If you do research in terms of what they care for, because we don't have that picture when we're talking about caring and assessment, right? How would you do that sort of research? How would you triangulate the conversation so that universities are still autonomous, university professors and all the components of the university can be kept autonomous, but at the same time, they're able to learn to listen to those dynamics outside of the university that are probably going to be more concerned with certain competencies that we're not even thinking about as we're educating our students. How would you do the research of just finding out how these conversations could happen? Maybe setting up some experimental pilot dialogues and capturing those. What sort of things would you do to investigate that the potential for that sort of transformational process?
Well, I guess it would need to start from a very critical, self-reflexive stance from academy or higher education itself. We've been talking about grade chunkies, and that might leave the impression that, at least I was talking about students as grade chunkies and teachers as people who want to uphold this kind of a system. But look at us academics. We are the worst grade chunkies there are in the world. This week, it's Tuesday evening for me, and I already needed to look for my age index and some other metrics for 2 different applications. Like, we are the grade chunkies. We need to do something about this massive issue with academic capitalism and how that influences every single thing we do in academia, and how we take part in discourses and conversations about grading, and how actually, even when we're doing critical work on that, we need to do that within the scope of measurement. I mean, I've written critical pieces about assessment, and I benefit from those because they count towards my age index and citations or whatever. So yeah, I do think that we at least need to stop valorizing academy as some kind of a place that has the right to criticize students and teachers for these things, while actually very much taking part in the very same discourses of competition and measurement.
So briefly, you mentioned H index, and so just for folks with engaging in the podcast, what is the H index?
That is one of the magical academic indices that we use to measure our worth. So as H index is a way of quantifying your academic citations. So every time you publish something, someone else might cite that, and every time they do, you get a point, so to say. So you get a citation. And now there needs to be a way of quantifying how productive you've been, how many publications you've published that are actually noted in earlier research. So H-index is a way of quantifying. Should I need to explain the actual formula? Quantifying how many well-noted studies you have actually published. If you have an H-index of 15, that means that you have published 15 articles that have 15 citations.
Yeah, thank you for that, Juuso. And as you mentioned, at this time of the recording, it's approaching midnight there in Hong Kong. And Juuso is very much thinking about his H-index and thinking and the assessment of.
That also speaks of Juuso's brilliance. I mean, if you talk to me at midnight, maybe I forget my name and I'm not even able to articulate anything. So I mean, that gives you an idea of what we would do if we interview have this recording at a different time when Juuso is having more of the actual coffee and the freshness of starting his day and that kind of thing. So it's really a privilege, Juuso, to have been learning with you these years as part of our New Frontiers research group that we have been cultivating with Annette and Juuso and some other folks who have been participating with us. So I've grown a lot in learning about assessment just by dialoguing with you. And of course, this podcast is not an exception. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, indeed, Juuso. Thank you. It's been such an honor and privilege to have you join this podcast as a guest and share your stories and insights about assessments and care. So if you would like to let folks know who are engaging in this podcast where they could find more, I mean, you share a lot of really awesome publications and besides being an H-index, I mean, I think they're valuable in many ways for folks to learn more about. So where can they find your work? Where can they connect with you? Do you want to share that with our podcast group?
Yeah, sure thing. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot, which I always do when I have a chat with you too. And yeah, if you think I was smart during this conversation, imagine how smart I am during the daytime in my own first language. Just kidding.
Right.
You can find me at juusonieminen.com, which is my own website. Doesn't really have a lot of content, mostly my contact details, like my email if you want to stay in contact. And I am quite active on Twitter or X, or what are the name of it? Because I refuse to call it X. Let's just call it Twitter. Yeah, exactly. So at Juuso Nieminen. That's how you'll find me.
All right. Thank you so much, Juuso. And it is, again, very late there in Hong Kong. So we will end this podcast and we'll be following up with you shortly.
Thank you so much for engaging with the DES podcast. We post new episodes every few weeks. The DES podcast is made possible and sustainable in solidarity with you and those who generously volunteer their time to converse with us. We hope you join us on our next episode.